Go. Well, it is a great honor to welcome Professor Andrew Bacevich on this podcast. He is the Professor Emeritus of History and International Relations at Boston University. And we're here to talk about his recent article in Foreign Affairs magazine titled The Reckoning That Wasn't: Why America Remains Trapped by False Dreams of Hegemony. How are you today, Andrew? Thank you for joining the show.
Very fine, thank you.
I wish
Glad
to
to be with
begin
you.
by talking about an institute which you founded and are president of, the Quincy Institute, which I recently learned is not named after Quincy Jones. So tell me about what
Uh-huh.
it is and what its founding mission is.
Yeah, it's named after John Quincy Adams, uh, of the famous Adams family.
Mhm.
Uh, the Quincy Institute is a Washington think tank. Of course, Washington is filled with dozens of think tanks. I think what distinguishes us, three things. First of all, we're focused narrowly on U.S. foreign policy. Second is we are nonpartisan. We don't lean left, we don't lean right. And third, and probably most importantly, we define our mission in terms of restraint. That is to say, we advocate a foreign policy based on a principle of restraint. Some would argue, oh, that must mean isolationism. No, it does not. We firmly believe in the need to have the United States engaged in the world, but we think that the engagement in recent decades has emphasized military action or military threats, and that has not served the interest of our country at all.
Mhm. Okay. So tell me about the significance of naming the institute after President John Quincy Adams.
Well, I think by most estimations, he was a failed president. Uh, he was also, I think, by most estimations, a very significant figure in U.S. history, not least of all because of his principled opposition to slavery in the years prior to the Civil War. But for our purposes, his significance lies in his performance as Secretary of State. I think many historians believe that John Quincy Adams was the greatest Secretary of State the nation has ever had, and our embrace of him really is key to a famous speech that he gave on the 4th of July, 1821, I think, in which he said he warned against the danger of going abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And his point was that were the United States to succumb to this temptation, that we would be putting our own security and our own democracy at risk. And it's our view that that, in fact, has what's happened over the past several decades as we have pursued militarized hegemony. And therefore, the John Quincy Adams warning of way back when, a couple centuries ago, still has great relevance to us today.
I see. Well, I guess just to let the audience know that I guess you know what you're talking about. You have an extensive career as a military man, an officer in the U.S. military, and I'd like you to tell us briefly, your career.
Well, I served in I graduated from the military academy way back in 1969, served in the Army for 23 years, and then got out in 1992. And since then, I've pursued a second career as an academic, as a writer, and now as a co-founder of the Quincy Institute. By the way, I'm not the president, I'm the chairman. I used to be the president. So it's been a career in which I've had one foot in the Army and one foot in, I guess we would say, in academia.
Mhm. Right. So this essay, this article that you wrote for Foreign Affairs magazine is one of many that reflects upon the U.S. invasion of Iraq 20 years later. And first of all, I'd like to ask you, what were your views of the invasion when it was first launched in 2003?
I thought it was a very risky proposition. Now, at that moment, the assumptions of U.S. military supremacy were very much in uh, in play. Was the common thought among Americans that we had a world-beating military. Saddam Hussein in Iraq obviously was very weak by comparison, and therefore the expectations of a quick and easy victory seemed in many quarters to be sensible. Uh, I'm not going to tell you that I said at that time, oh my gosh, this is going to be a disaster and we're going to be stuck in this place for years to come. But I was very wary, I think because of my study of military history more broadly, very wary of the predictions of short war, easy victory, no sweat, because that kind of thinking has in the past so often led to disaster. So I was very wary, and frankly was not particularly persuaded by the arguments made in subquarters that overthrowing Saddam would lead to a stable and democratic Iraq that would align itself with us, and that would then set the stage for further reforms in the Middle East so that the whole region would end up being stable, democratic, and friendly to the United States. All that seemed like a fantasy to me. And of course, it has turned out to be a fantasy, really one that people don't even want to talk about because in retrospect, it seems so absurd.
Mhm. So the war in Iraq been, has been decided by consensus to be a failure in U.S. foreign policy. And it's also been associated with a group of people known as the neoconservatives. So I wonder if you can explain or represent the neoconservative position on American foreign policy in general and regarding Iraq in particular.
Well, the neoconservatives, and I would emphasize my own view, is that they were not, and certainly are not, nearly as influential as some people have come to believe. I think there are still some quarters in among our countrymen who would argue that there's like this great neocon conspiracy, and that they're secretly running U.S. policy. Not true, never true. That said, during the, let's say, decade or so after the end of the Cold War, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they were loud, and they commanded a certain amount of exercise, a certain amount of influence. What was their view? Their view was that the end of the Cold War had, in essence, brought us to the end of history. Had brought us to had made clear that the United States enjoyed global primacy, and that the United States should put its power to work in bringing about the further spread of liberal democracy in places around the world, and that we were called upon to do that, and we had the capacity to do that. From the neoconservative perspective, Saddam Hussein in Iraq was the big the target, the exception, the holdout, the guy who wouldn't get with the program. And so they decided, well before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, they decided that Saddam had to go, that he was a danger to humanity, and that we could rather easily dispose of him, and all good things would then follow. So that was their argument for years before 9/11. And then when 9/11 happened in 2001, it was, in the eyes of neoconservatives, really an opportunity. Here at last is our chance to implement our dreams of capitalizing on the opportunity presented by the end of the Cold War. They were not dissuaded by the fact that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. I mean, they tried to contrive of stories that he did. They tried to cook up evidence that he had nuclear weapons, or at least was about to acquire nuclear weapons, and therefore, from that point of view, posed a danger. They tried to make up stories about Saddam Hussein conspiring with Osama bin Laden. All that was nonsense. But all of that, I think, helped to create the climate that the George W. Bush administration was able to exploit as we go from 2002 to 2003 in making the case to the American people that this war of choice was in fact a war of necessity. So the neoconservatives played a role, I think, in shaping the environment in American politics in ways that helped to set the stage for the Iraq War. Again, they didn't, they weren't calling the shots. They weren't whispering in George W. Bush's ears. I think today their influence is greatly diminished, but nonetheless, people keep talking about them as we are.
Mhm. Okay. So allow me to play devil's advocate for a bit. So
Sure.
if I were to represent the Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan position of the case for overthrowing Saddam, I would say that, well, he does pose a threat to, well, not just liberal democracy, but humanitarian concerns too, in that he is a danger to the Iraqi people, chiefly the Iraqi Kurds. And also, as we've seen in his invasion of Kuwait, he is also a threat to the international balance of power in the Middle East, which, the realists among U.S. foreign policy thinkers would be rightly worried about. So, um, with that said, we need to get this guy out of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And ever since we got this guy out of the picture, Iraq has had a succession line of democratically elected presidents. So, how would you answer to that?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't agree that Iraq qualifies in any meaningful sense as a stable liberal democracy at this point. It seems to me that it's a mess. Now, but let's go back to the earlier points. Uh, uh, Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator who mistreated his people. How many brutal dictators are there in the world today? I guess President Xi would qualify as one. President Putin would certainly qualify as one. We can look in other parts of the world. Uh, Yemen would be one example, Somalia, an example, uh, where, where people are oppressed and abused. Uh, is it the job of the United States of America? Terrible situations. I mean, you can make an argument that yeah, that's our job, but why does Iraq go to the front of the line? There are places far closer to the United States. I mean, nobody pays much attention to what's going on in Nicaragua, but Nicaragua is ruled by a brutal dictatorship. The people are abused. We actually have a significant historical responsibility for the conditions in Nicaragua because for a good part of the first half of the 20th century, we occupied that country and failed to deliver on the promises made pursuant to our occupation. So you want to go save part of the world? Let's go save Nicaragua. How about Mexico? I mean, Mexico run by drug cartels. The drug cartels contribute to the death annually of 100,000 Americans. Well, let's go fix Mexico. Of course, I'm being sarcastic because the notion of quote unquote fixing Mexico is absurd, is way beyond the capacity of the United States. So I find the argument that Saddam Hussein was a terrible guy and was beating up on the Iraqi people, A, true, and B, hypocritical. And therefore, I'm simply not buying that as a genuine explanation for what motivated the George W. Bush administration to do what it did back in 2003. You know, I think it's fair to say at this juncture that we have once again learned about how limited is our capacity to bring about positive political change in other parts of the world among peoples who we don't particularly understand and who have their own complex histories that we can't sort out It's easy to say they deserve peace, they deserve democracy, they deserve freedom. They do deserve those things. But it doesn't seem to me that a bunch of people sitting around a table in Washington have the ability to say, yeah, and here's how we're going to make that happen. The other point I think would be that, and I don't think even in the Quincy Institute we talk about this enough, but uh, the wars we have undertaken, and the Iraq War is a classic example, have had terrible negative consequences for the United States itself. I'm not simply talking about the number of soldiers dead and wounded, although we certainly should remember that. I'm not talking about the couple of trillion dollars that we expended in trying to fix Iraq. I'm really talking about our own domestic crisis, the disunity in our country. Uh, I wouldn't argue that all of that stems directly from the Iraq War. I would argue that the Iraq War and other foolish military undertakings contribute directly to that. How does somebody like Donald Trump become president of the United States? Big question, complex answer. Part of the answer has to be that he demonstrated great skill, there's no other word, skill in tapping into the anger of the American people with his false promises that, I can fix everything. I am your protector. I am your savior. And I think that the credibility of those promises stems in part from the way that Americans were deeply distressed by the direction of U.S. policy in places like Iraq, in places like Afghanistan, and so on. So I think I understand the neoconservative argument, but I think it just doesn't hold any water.
So Winston Churchill famously said, study history, for in history lies the secret of statecraft. And since we're referencing your Quincy Institute, perhaps history is the key to responsible statecraft as well.
I
So,
think you're right. Very good.
so I guess, do you agree with Winston Churchill? And if so, do expand on that proposition of his?
Well, I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, my academic discipline was history. So yeah, I mean, if I were a political scientist, I would tell you how important political science is. But I was trained as a historian, so I'll tell you how important history is. Uh, but it ain't that simple. I mean, it's not as if history is a rule book, and we can flip it open to some page that's relevant, and we can find the 5 key points that will uh, illuminate decisions made by policymakers, enabling us to avoid stupidity and enabling us to pursue a wise course. I think statecraft is fraught with enormous uncertainties and risks, and therefore it requires prudent judgment. And where does prudence come from? We don't necessarily elect as president people who possess those capacities. I think George W. Bush is probably a man, in many respects, is a well-intentioned man. He loves his country. He wishes his countrymen well. He was caught totally by surprise and unprepared by the 9/11 attacks, which must have been a source of humiliation and great pain. It's on his watch that this happens. But he didn't possess any particular grasp of history. He didn't possess any particular wisdom. I think he therefore responded to reckless advisors who weren't as smart as they imagined that they were, and embarked upon a course of action that was flawed. He was the president. He's responsible for the outcome. Not solely, but to a large extent, he's responsible for the outcome. There were alternatives available at the time that he probably didn't even seriously consider, but might have been considered in retrospect. There were people, again, at the time, not me, but there were people at the time who said, hey, wait a second. The proper response to the 9/11 attacks is not to go to war. And it's certainly not to go to war with something called terrorism, which is a tactic. They said the correct response is to embark upon a police action, international police action, targeting specific terrorist organizations, in this case, Al Qaeda. Eliminate Al Qaeda, and you probably will not prevent, but certainly reduce the likelihood of a repetition of 9/11. I think that was a realistic alternative that did not receive serious consideration in the highest levels of the US government.
So you emphasize the fact that it is not America's national interest to seek out, to quote John Quincy Adams, monsters abroad to destroy. So, in your view, what should the national interest of the United States of America be?
Well, I don't want to evade the question because it is of central importance, but I think our responsibility is to fulfill the aspirations expressed in the preamble of the Constitution. That document lays out a set of goals, objectives, reasons for the formation of our union. None of them say save the world. None of them say spread democracy. And therefore, I think, as in so many cases, we need to go back to the Constitution and take seriously the words that the framers wrote. And I think that would at least provide the basis for a more realistic approach to foreign policy than we have seen over the past 30 years or so.
Well,
I mean, the preamble says, provide for the common defense. It doesn't say disarm. It doesn't say, ignore the possibility of violence in our world. It says provide for the common defense. It doesn't say create instruments of power projection and station them in hundreds of bases around the world. Provide for the common defense. That's a fairly modest, but I think fairly specific aspiration. That's what we should be doing, and that's what we've totally lost sight of that since World War II.
I see. So in the foreign affairs essay, you note that, well, as a historian, you posit that the I guess the ideology, or at least the conception of American national interest as spreading democracy and getting rid of dictators around the globe, didn't just start with the Iraq War or the election of Bush or even the Vietnam War, maybe. It starts with a document called NSC 68, drafted by the U.S. State Department's policy planning staff, led at the time by Paul Nitze. So what does that document say?
Well, the document depicts a world divided by the forces of freedom and liberty against the forces of totalitarianism, or to put it another way, the West against the communist world, or to put it another way, the United States of America against the Soviet Union, and depicts this rivalry as an existential struggle, one in which military force, the availability of military power will ultimately serve a decisive role. So it's an argument for rearmament. It's an argument for the development of massive nuclear arsenals as part of targeting the Soviets. So it's the blueprint for what becomes U.S. policy in the Cold War.
Right. So another famous document that laid out the basis for U.S. foreign policy within the Cold War is what's known as the Long Telegram, or the X article. The identity of Mr. X is now we all know is George Kennan, and he suggested a policy of containment. And I guess how would you represent Kennan's argument as he laid out in that article?
Well, if we look at Soviet conduct, there's ambiguity in the way the articles. Kennan was a beautiful stylist, famous as an eloquent writer, but there's ambiguity in the article, which you are right to point out its formative importance. An ambiguity that resulted in interpretation and implementation that Kennan himself ultimately rejected. Uh, because the way sources of Soviet conduct was read as a call for rearmament and confrontation. What Kennan says he meant is that it was called for a patient resistance that would not be primarily focused on arms and military efforts. I think the key point he was making was that in the long run, patient resistance will prevail, that the Soviet system was doomed, and we just needed to wait them out. And that's and that implies, I think he meant, less activism on our part than turned out to be the case. How does sources of Soviet conduct justify sending 500,000 troops to Southeast Asia in the 1960s? You sort of scratch your head. In retrospect, we scratch our head and say, "My God, what the hell were they thinking? What a catastrophic disaster that was." But if you take seriously the kind of ideological perspective offered by NSC 68, you can talk yourself into thinking that the Vietnam War was in fact justified and necessary. Not too many people would buy that these days.
Okay. So that leads me to the fact that, well, Kennan, as the years go on, he would distance himself from this conception of containment, or at least the
Yeah,
application of that conception by the
yeah, yeah.
bigwigs in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, and
Yep, you're right.
he famously opposed the war in Vietnam. So, what was his
Yep,
argument
and the
against?
Iraq War.
Yeah, of course, he would do that too.
Hmm.
So, what was his argument against going into Vietnam?
Well, I think, see, the we did skipped over this, and we shouldn't. That the perspective expressed in NSC 68 assumed that we were opposing a monolith, that there was something called the communist world, and that the communist world was dominated by the Soviet, not simply dominated by the Soviet Union, but that the various components of the communist world basically took their marching orders from the Kremlin. And that line of thought, by the 1960s, persuaded the Kennedy administration, and then even more fatefully the Lyndon Johnson administration, that the United States had a stake in the outcome of the war ongoing in Vietnam. Now, that was a war between two artificially created countries. We call them North Vietnam, we call them South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese insisted throughout that there was only one Vietnam, and they were intending to reunite the separate halves. And the kind of thinking expressed in NSC 68 led policymakers to include that the U.S. had a vital interest in maintaining the territorial integrity and independence of South Vietnam, of the Republic of Vietnam, and that this was so important to us that this was an issue worth fighting for. Why? Why was it important? Because the argument went, this was called the domino theory, because the argument went that if the communists prevailed in Vietnam, if the Republic of Vietnam went communist, that there would be a continued effect that would lead to further successes and the further communization of large parts of Asia. Uh, there's little basis for thinking that. But I mean, there was little basis for thinking that Saddam Hussein possessed nuclear weapons. But in Vietnam, as in Iraq in the first part of the 21st century, these sort of mythic sort of notions took hold and shaped policy. And really, in a sense, demonstrating the continued relevance of the John Quincy Adams quote. You know, we persuaded ourselves in the 1960s, we persuaded ourselves in 2003 to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And we persuaded ourselves that we had good reason to do this. Moral reasons and geopolitical reasons. In both cases, it was nonsense.
Right. I'd like to quote from your essay now. The war in Ukraine might offer one last chance for Washington to learn a Suez-style lesson and without even suffering a defeat. And this, of course, refers to the Suez Crisis of 1956 and how you posit that the United Kingdom lost its place as a global superpower after the disastrous handling of that particular crisis. So I guess if I can ask another history lesson from you, how did the Suez Crisis, I guess, led to British decline in, I guess, global power status?
Well, I think British decline was already a reality. What Suez did, I think, was drive home the fact that Britain's moment was over, that the empire was over, that Britain's claim to being in the first rank of powers was no longer to be taken seriously. What happened? What happened was that the decline of European influence in and around the Middle East, or to put it another way, the rise of Arab nationalism, resulted in discrediting European claims to control in the region. Now, I'm not an expert on all this, but I think I'm correct in saying generally, Egypt had been a protectorate of Great Britain for decades, valued by the British for a number of reasons, but valued in particular because the Suez Canal runs through Egyptian territory. A revolution in Egypt brings to power Nasser. Nasser's popularity, in many respects, rests on his opposition to British authority. And for reasons we don't need to go into here, he nationalizes the canal. This canal is on Egyptian soil. It belongs to Egyptians. Now, they hadn't built it, but they were now laying claim to it. Nasser insisted that that was intolerable. Insisted that the canal would remain would be Egyptian, and the British, quite foolishly, in conjunction with the French, who had their own reasons to dislike Nasser, related to Algeria mostly, and with the assistance of the Israelis, who had their own reasons to dislike Nasser, concocted a truly wild scheme whereby the Israelis launched an invasion of the Sinai, Israeli forces heading toward the canal. And the British government and the French government say, this is shocking. This is a terrible thing. We will intervene to defend the canal. Now, in fact, the Brits, the French, and the Israelis had secretly conspired to come up with this idea. So the Brits and the French then launch a military intervention to save the canal, and they do this without consulting the United States. They do this days before a presidential election in the United States. And President Eisenhower goes absolutely nuts and insists that the Brits terminate this misguided thing and promises to punish them egregiously if they refuse to obey his directions. Well, they don't refuse. They terminate the intervention. Nasser then gains permanent control of the canal, which is, it remains Egyptian down to the present moment. The point is that Britain's this was the last time Britain, maybe with the partial exception of the Falklands War, which is a pretty small scale undertaking, but this is the last real effort on the part of Great Britain to pursue an independent policy. And it's in that sense that it ends their claim to being a great power. From that point onward, whatever they want to do, they sort of check with Uncle Sam first and make sure that Uncle Sam is going to either support them or at least acquiesce.
I'm reminded that Jorge Luis Borges' description of the Falkland Islands War, two bald men fighting over a comb. That's what he said.
Two bald men fighting over a comb. the Argentines and the Brits. Okay, yeah.
So to continue your quotation, so far, U.S. policy on Ukraine has been pragmatic and arguably restrained. But President Joe Biden and his team routinely talk about the war in ways that suggest an outmoded, moralistic, and recklessly grandiose vision of American power. Well, I guess first, do you elaborate on that particular proposition?
Well, see, the administration depicts this as a world historic event where the fate of democracy is on the line. The president and others in his have repeatedly said that we live in a moment in which authoritarianism is opposing democracy. One side or the other is going to prevail. And that defines the stakes in Ukraine and other places, but especially in Ukraine. I think that's a vastly oversimplified depiction of history. I don't think history is about liberalism or democracy being opposed by some great cosmic force like authoritarianism, or for that matter, fascism, or for that matter, communism. And I certainly don't think that that is an adequate depiction of how this war began and what it's about. I think this is an unnecessary war. I think that it could arguably, maybe not, arguably could have been prevented had the United States and others in the West been willing to at least acknowledge that Russia has important security interests at stake. It's been our position that that's not the case. It's been our position, for example, that NATO expansion has no negative security implications for Russia. And of course, if you're a Pole or you're a Lithuanian, that makes all the sense in the world. Hey, we just want to be free. But I think Churchill, among others, would say that in statecraft, it's always important to look at the problem from the other guy's perspective. And from the other guy's perspective, from Putin's perspective, he has every reason to fear, to be concerned about, to oppose the further expansion of NATO into regions that Russia has traditionally viewed as essential to their own security and well-being. And there have been any number of Americans. I mean, Kennan famously warned against any NATO expansion that would consider bringing Ukraine into the alliance. The current CIA director, when he was U.S. ambassador to Moscow, warned against thinking about bringing Ukraine into NATO. And the Biden administration's perspective is that no, why should they be concerned? This poses no threat to them. Well, they get to decide what poses a threat to them, just as we do. So we didn't want to listen to them, and I think that that is a very important explanation for why the war began. Nothing I just said excuses Russian aggression. Nothing I just said uh, uh, gets in the way of judging Putin to be a brutal dictator, because that's what he is. But we can still conclude that the war was unnecessary.
So, the internationally renowned foreign policy scholar and a Quincy Institute fellow, John Mearsheimer, suggested that the best course of action would be a guarantee of Ukraine being a neutral state, neither a Russian proxy or a
Yeah,
Western-oriented democracy. Um,
yeah.
is it your opinion that that option is still a viable one, and would it be?
I don't know. I mean, it's a very pertinent question. I don't know. I mean, that was a good idea a year ago. Now we have all this blood having been spilled. We have all this rhetoric coming out of the West, all the freedom and democracy rhetoric. Now we have the Ukrainian people every reason to be outraged. Uh, I don't know if that's still possible. All I know, I mean, or at least all I believe, is that this war has to end. And the longer it goes on, the heavier the penalty paid by everybody. It seems unlikely that either side is going to win a decisive victory. Certainly, there's a lot of loose talk in the West and the United States about quote unquote defeating Russia. I must say, my concern would be that if we pursue that as a serious objective, that we are inviting a nuclear war. There's nothing that I see. I've never met Putin. I don't know the man. There's nothing I've seen in Putin that suggests that he's going to uh, succumb to pressure. That he's going to say, "Oh my God, this has gone on too long. We need to call it off." And he has a very large nuclear arsenal at his disposal. So I think that I don't have any magic answer to how to end the war, but that that's the urgent question. So much of the public discussion of this war is, well, should we provide Ukraine with F-16s? And should we provide Ukraine with longer range artillery? Those are interesting tactical questions. I don't mean that they're insignificant. Uh, but the big question is, how do we end this catastrophic conflict? And that doesn't seem to get a lot of attention, at least in the public discussion. Maybe, I hope, behind closed doors, that the Biden administration is working 24/7 to come up with a negotiated settlement. But we can't see that.
I guess so in your view, what would be the best or at least the least bad outcome of this war, assuming that it will end in terms of US national interests?
Well, I think that some kind of guarantees of uh, Ukrainian independence, not necessarily encompassing all of uh, Ukrainian territory as it existed, let's say, prior to 2014. I think that probably uh, Russia will gain, and that's going to stick in people's craw. But if you want to end the war, that may be part of the price that you have to pay. So, Ukraine restored, security guarantees, some form of neutrality, uh, maybe some kind of relationship with the European Union that will enable Ukraine economically to advance itself. Although how long it'll take to repair all the damage done, I don't know. But something like that. And also, I think it's time for NATO to informally agree that the NATO expansion project is over. You know, to further encroach on what the Russians see as their sphere of influence is going to be very costly and is, I think, unnecessary.
I guess I should end this with a I guess a mentioning Thucydides, the great the great historian, the greatest since Herodotus. And um, what I learned from the history of the Peloponnesian War is the abundance of lessons that it teaches in terms of history, military strategy, and political philosophy to people generations after, including our contemporary leaders. So my final question is, what what are some of the lessons that future American commanders in chief, or even current ones, should learn urgently from Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War?
Well, I mean, what's the Melian dialogue? You know, the powerful do what they can, the weak do what they must. Am I getting it right? I think I am. Uh, but power is never as great as the powerful think that it is. You know, that that power always has limits, and if you exceed those limits, then even the powerful end up being punished. I mean, that's Putin's story. Uh, Putin imagined, falsely, recklessly, that a powerful Russian army would make quick work of a comparatively weak Ukrainian army. Well, it turned out the Russian army wasn't nearly as competent as I guess he fancied, and it turned out that the Ukrainian people were courageous in mounting resistance. Well, guess what? Putin's Putin's not the only one uh, susceptible to that kind of arrogance and recklessness. That if we broaden the aperture of recent history to include the entire post-Cold War period, in other words, the period since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we ourselves have repeatedly uh, overestimated the extent of our own power and influence in ways that have, I think, cost our country dearly. And it saddens me that even now in 2023, that hasn't sunk in. We still have all this talk about having the most powerful military in the world, or of America's great liberating tradition. We need to we need we need to reflect in a sober way on who we are and what we are likely to accomplish. We can't continue down this path.
On that note, thank you very much, Professor Andrew Bacevich, for being on this show. You've been very gracious with your time and insight. I wish you all the
Thanks a
best
lot.
with
Good luck to
managing the
you.
crisis. Thank you, and take care.
Thanks.